you. So my name's Ali Porti, and I went to Hult here. You all have a nice building because we weren't in this building. We were in Russell Square at the time, all cramped in. So this is really nice. And so I stumbled into fashion. My bachelor's degree is in history and my master's is in international relations when Hult had an international relations program. And why I got into fashion is because I was living in Beirut and I was helping with Syrian refugees and I needed some income. So I started writing for Harper's Bazaar Arabia, and the new editor-in-chief at that time, an Egyptian Canadian woman, she let me start writing. And all of the fashion magazines for the Middle East, they're based in Dubai. So I started covering Lebanese accessories and ready-to-wear designers. And then I needed to go to Paris to visit a friend, and they had nobody, Harper's Bazaar Arabia had nobody covering Paris Fashion Week, Couture Week. So I started sitting front row and covering couture designers, and I had to develop being thrown into being able to describe collections and silhouettes, and that was my entryway into fashion. And today I write for Forbes and The Hollywood Reporter. I've just come from Paris Fashion Week, covering the past 8 days nonstop, Valentino, Dior, all the big shows, and it's quite fun and exciting. I should be working at the UN, but I'm in fashion, and I met Laboni through London Fashion Week and being connected through Instagram, and just amazed at her talent and what she does. So I would like to hear, Laboni, how you got started in fashion, because the great thing about fashion is that there's a place for everyone. If you're business-minded, they need business people and running fashion brands. If you are a great writer, if you like journalism, you have a place as a journalist. If you're a creative designer, there's a place for you. If you're in law, there's a place for you. There's even a law fashion course at Fordham University just focused on fashion law. So there's a place for everyone, and I'd love to hear your entryway. Did you always have a passion in fashion?
Yeah, so to start with, very inspired by your story, Ali, you know, how you got into fashion, and thank you first of all for having me on this really special talk. So my journey into fashion was a little bit like, I was into clothing before I even knew as a child the term fashion. So you know, when growing up, you would always have dolls that you play with, and I was never happy with the dolls the outfit they came in. I wanted to change it. And then when I was maybe 6, 7 years old, my parents were buying clothes and I didn't want to wear it like they were, and I would want to kind of cut them up and do things. So it's almost out of disinterest in what was given to me in terms of clothing and how the dolls were dressed and so forth. So, but I think at the time I didn't know the term fashion, but as I was growing up, you know, I kind of understood that there is a pathway, a career pathway where you can work with clothes and design in clothes. But my career in fashion started as a fashion buyer, interestingly enough, although my degree was in fashion design. When I was doing my master's in fashion business with University of Westminster, I got the opportunity to start working as a fashion buyer. So that was my step into the industry, and my discovery wasn't that pleasant one. You know, from the outside we see fashion as this glamorous, fluffy, you know, stunning things going on. But the inside story was more like the speed at which the industry runs is not the most sustainable one. You know, we are producing 4 collections every year, and
sometimes 5 or 6. The big houses.
Absolutely, yes. And if you go to high street retailers, they're doing a new collection every 14 days. So what that meant was that as a buyer, we were having to push more product than needed to in the market, and expect people to buy it within short time frames and buy a lot more than they actually need. So we were creating desirability of more items than is humanly needed in someone's wardrobe. So it's a kind of, that made me think, why are we doing what we're doing? Who is defining the speed at which the industry runs? You know, and if you do a bit of thinking, you see that it's all down to how much you want to see in the revenue. So the willingness to push more product is because the companies are wanting to make more revenue, and you know, kind of in a way brainwashing the customer to buy more than they need to. So that's what led me to start my own company, Saha, the brand, where the main principle behind the brand was to create timeless collections. And by timeless, we meant it was never going to go out of season. You would not need to mark it down and push more than you need to. And you know, if you bought something from us in 2014, there is a piece from 2014 in that film there that's playing. So you know, this film is from 2021, and there are pieces there from 2014, so 7 years ago. So that seasonality aspect was totally out of the context. And there are other pillars about sustainability that I wanted to focus on. But the main aim was to take seasonality out of fashion. And early days, I had mentors who told me not to use the word timeless in the description, but I didn't want to kind of step away from what I, you know, started the company for. So short answer to a quite long story, I would say. This is how I kind of got into starting a company.
And you were doing this seasonless collection before it became a thing, because we saw with COVID, a lot of people started buying not fast fashion, but buying couture or bespoke pieces that would last a long time. The buying patterns changed. Have you seen that with your brand?
Definitely. I think people are a lot more mindful where they spend their money and what is the need, what is really the need. Because I think back in the days, pre-COVID, people were maybe going to a lot more parties, they were hosting a lot more, you know, events and things like that. So I think when it came to the disposable income, people became a little bit more careful as to what they really needed to spend on, and it became a lot more about, I think, quality over quantity, because the same customer who's buying designer outfits to go to an event would also be a customer who might also be shopping from other brands where they need a new outfit for every weekend or every night out, and maybe they would not repeat that outfit for months to come. So I think because that element kind of went out of the picture, people were able to invest in pieces that are long-term, you know, investment in a way that a nice jumper or a kimono that you can wear for years to come. So yeah, I think definitely seen that within the brand, and generally speaking as well.
So this year's theme for International Women's Day is Break the Bias, where it's asking people to cross your arms in solidarity to gender bias and discrimination and stereotyping. And I want to ask you, as someone in the fashion industry, how have you seen gender bias and discrimination in fashion, and how have you dealt with it?
I think in a way, working in fashion makes us lucky, because in the UK at least, the fashion industry is predominantly female. There is a lot of very senior decision-making people who are females, so the gender bias is not so prominent. But I can tell you gender bias in the family. You know, let's say when I started the business, I had really little faith coming from the male side of my family that I was able to do it in a country that I'm new in, and often been suggested that my brother should come over and help me, or that I should go back to my home country and open the business there, because I have my father, my brothers, my uncles. So I think bias is something I grew up with, and I'm nothing against Indian, I'm Indian, but I think it's something embedded so deep in our parents' generation that they do it as a way of protecting you, but at the same time it is bias. So, but I think I have to let my actions speak as opposed to, you know, standing against. So I think in the industry, discrimination not so much, but in a general sense, yes, there has been.
I don't know if you'll know the answer to this question, but in couture fashion, you find that it's mainly men designers designing gowns and couture pieces. Why do you think that is? And why don't you think we have enough women designing couture gowns? I was once talking to Ava Cavalli, and she was saying, because she really helped transform the Roberto Cavalli brand, and she was saying, you know, men think that they know what looks sexy on a woman. They will show too much cleavage or something, but you know, I'm a woman and I know what women are wanting in design. Why do you think there's more men designing at the couture level? And
I think it's an interesting, very interesting question, because I've not noticed that until now that you mentioned this.
Sure.
I think definitely the man's understanding of how they want to see a woman plays a big role. in the way they would design. So, but I think maybe the couture space is quite limited, right? I mean, the Zuhair Murad and the Laboni Saha, and there aren't so many couture designers as there are ready to wear and, you know, designer labels in general. So it's a question I don't really know an answer for, why women haven't gone down that route. But,
maybe because in Lebanon, or the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans came through, so you have this artsy culture where the Lebanese people picked up the skills and craftsmanship. But it seems that it's the men whose, you know, their grandmothers and mothers in villages, and I think it's this way in India
as well, yeah.
Villages who have this skill of craftsmanship, but it seems like maybe the grandmothers were teaching it to men. And then, you know, Laboni Saha grows up and Zuhair Murad grows up and they're creating these gowns.
It's true. I mean, if I look at the Indian couture space, certainly there's a lot more men doing couture than women. I think it could also be down to funding, you know, because to run a designer label, you need a different scale of funding in comparison to running a couture house, which I think is a lot more in need of a lot bigger funding. It could be that men were able to secure larger funding or you know, attract the kind of investment that's needed to run a couture house.
Yeah.
But I think happy to say that, you know, even Chanel, which was founded by a woman, has a couture department as well, which are, you know, not of the very recent times, but was in a time probably where it would have been more difficult for women to attract funding than they did. And, you know, I think that's quite inspiring.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so 2 last questions before opening it up. I know that you focus a lot on sustainability and eco-friendly practices within your brand. Fashion is the second most unsustainable industry in the world, unfortunately, with flying products, plastics, and bottles for perfumes and everything. So did you join the fashion industry with a hope? I know you were saying it came from not liking Barbie dolls or clothes, but to want to change this about the industry.
Definitely. I think, like I mentioned, the seasonless aspect was the initial trigger to want to start a label that does not follow that rule, where you make your own product irrelevant after a very short span of time. But I think the closer I looked into the industry, the more it became evident all the elements that needed to be changed. And then that brings back memories of childhood where I would, you know, I grew up in India and we would hear about textile industry, textile mills back home, where, you know, you would hear your parents, or, you know, I mean, my family's not in the textile business, but they would talk about plants where it takes the same amount of investment to set up a textile dyeing plant, and then to recycle the waste, it takes equal amount of investment. So it's the point of, do I double my capacity or do I invest in the recycling? You know, so those kind of things kind of were brought back to my memory, because back then I used to think of fashion as a glamorous space and a great creative outlet to, you know, your thought and your willingness to create beautiful things. But the system behind it, by default, you can't make a beautiful piece of garment without the dyeing, without the, you know, chemical process that a fabric goes through. So I think the reason why I wanted to keep those things as streamlined as possible is because I think when you streamline a process, then the waste out of it is simpler, or, you know, easier to process before it's released into the environment. And it is a dream to have a vertically integrated kind of supply chain where I can see where the fiber is being made, I can see the thing being dyed, and I can see it being woven into fabric or into a dress under the same roof, because the moment it's happening in different parts of the world, it's the carbon footprint of flying things back and forth, but also the lack of transparency, because on paper a lot of things are sustainable practice, but is it actually? And you don't get to see because it's probably not, you know, easily commutable distance, or it's in different continent altogether. So I think, but I also am a big believer that a brand alone can't make shifts happen in the world. So we do our bit as a brand to do things in the right way, but equally shouting out about it to hopefully inspire a few other people to do the same, all whilst being commercially viable. Because we can do great things, but if you're not successful as a business, you go out of business very soon. So it's never at the cost of the business, or it's never at the cost of the comfort or the need of the customer. It's always putting those things at the front, but doing the thing that needs to be done in terms of sustainability behind the scene, almost as it's expected from the business to do it that way.
And also what came to mind, fashion is the second most unsustainable industry, but it's the #1 violator of labor rights, because you have Italy with all these factories and working Africans and Arabs who are trying to have a footing in Italy, but they're not being paid or they're being mistreated. Do you work through Italy with leathers, or any sort of, do you trace to make sure that the person who oversees a warehouse or a factory who's producing the materials that you use, that their workers are treated well?
I think as a smaller business, I have the ability to visit all the factories that we've ever worked with and wish to work with in the future, and oftentimes it's building an understanding and a relation with how they work before we actually go ahead and work with them. So, working with factories in Italy, we don't do work with leather, so that's not been an issue, but I've personally visited, and some of the factories we work with are run by family-owned businesses, so they're run by family who has been doing this for generations. So I think they value their people because it is a small-scale factory. It's not the mass manufacturing factories, where if you lose a particular, machinist or a technologist, it impacts your entire workforce. So they value that, but I think the disparity happens where, what you mentioned about people being underpaid or labor rights being violated, that happens where some aspects of the supply chain is not visible. Let's say I work in the product development team of a XYZ British brand, and I need to put this product in the market at £100, for instance. And in the whole process that, this order goes to the factory, there are a couple of different middlemen involved. So by the time it gets to the factory, all the margins and, cuts are being calculated, and the pressure to reduce cost is directly on the factory. And even to the fact that the factory manager or the owners won't take the hit. The hit is ultimately on the worker who's sitting on the machine, sometimes doing longer hours, sometimes, doing overtime without pay. And sad to say, in our part of the world, there are people who are working overtime, but still live below the poverty line. They have earnings that's below the poverty line. Why? Because someone out there, some Western brand is pushing for that product to be produced at this price. So it's great to say that, this country doesn't respect the labor rights, but who's buying from that country? It's in their interest to make sure that, they're not pushing for what is not reasonable, but it's being done. So.
Unfortunate, brands are trying to do better, LVMH and Kering, but there's a lot of work to do. Okay, so my last question, which might be of interest to students here, is, as I was saying before, fashion has a place for everyone, no matter what your skill is. Do you have any advice to maybe a student here who they're the business side, but they would like to know how do they get into fashion?
I think, like you said, fashion is a very, there are so many groups or so many sub-departments within a fashion company, right? From accounting to law to even business development and management and sales and so forth. So I think if you want to pursue a career, I think the best way to go about is network with companies, because, there are so many events happening in London where you could actually meet people, or, for example, this, where you could meet someone from the company, or, form a genuine, interest in the work that the company does, and see where your skill set could be of value within the company. And also use LinkedIn. I think it's a great way to connect with people from different companies. I think I'm deviating a little bit from your question, am I not?
No, but it's about putting yourself out there. Because it's hard to get into the fashion door. They push back against it because it's with the clothes and the glamour that comes with it, and the celebrities, and it's a large industry, but such a small ecosystem that you're rejected more than you're accepted in a role. I would say probably even in the business side.
I think that's a perception that's been built so far, but you and me, by people being in the industry, we need to change that. I think we need to be more open to listening to who's wanting to speak to us, and creating opportunities where you can value talent.
Yeah. So are there any questions?
I have two questions, but my first one is kind of related. What is your favorite networking fashion event in London? Like, is there any one you would recommend?
I think networking event as such, I think I'm talking about my student days. There would be sessions that the university would sometimes put together where you would have someone from a PR company or, so going to those events when I was a university student. But I think if you can, some of these trade shows and fashion week, there are events happening where you could get a pass as a student, as someone who just wants to observe. I think make as much effort as possible to try and put your foot through those spaces, because then even if it's just, a drinks reception from a brand or the British Fashion Council or a museum, it's one person that you could meet that could open doors for you. So, and you might go to 6 different events and only one person amongst those 6 different events could be of value. But, it's great to put yourself in those situations. And an initial rejection is not a final rejection. I think be persistent. If they say we can't accommodate you, then you can always stay in touch for the next season and request a, invite for the next season and so forth.
You said you had a second question?
I do, if that's okay. So with companies like DressX and other digital fashion companies, do you foresee your personal brand moving into the digital technology space? It has been touted as something very sustainable, and with the metaverse coming up, I was just curious if you could see your brand working in a different format.
I think that's a space we are looking at. It's not so familiar to us, because I think the brand was built on some of the very traditional ways of creating fashion, let's say handwork, craftsmanship, slower processes, which are totally opposite of digital, right? But I think we are fully aware that the digital space is the new world, and we don't want to close our eyes to that space. But I think it's the matter of knowing how to make sure that that ties into our other ethos, which is deeply rooted in sustainability and being low impact at the same time. So once we figured that out, we will be venturing into the digital space as well.
I have a question yet, but more towards the finance side of things. Just curious, where you went to start raising capital for your to start your business.
It depends in what scale you want to raise capital, because you could start with a small investment from friends, family around, or you could have a savings of something that you can save, and you can start small. In the UK, it is possible to start quite small. In fact, I started with my own savings. I worked 2 years after I graduated. I built some savings, and I started with literally next to nothing kind of money. But it's possible. But if you want to go down the more sophisticated route of fundraising, I think in fashion, I would say go down the debt line of investment or loans, as opposed to giving away equity to start with, because when a brand is just forming, it doesn't have that much, let's say, equity value. An investor might want 50% of your business for X amount in money, but 10 years down the line, that 50% would be worth a lot more. So if you can exist on loans or debt investment, or convertible loans, which can be equity or debt, go down that route. Again, here networking becomes a really important thing, because there are investors out there who might believe in your passion, your story, and invest in your brand without asking for too much of the equity. So, and go for someone who has a long-term vision of the brand, because luxury, in particular in fashion, is not a quick turnaround. You won't start seeing returns right away. So you and the investor needs to be on the right page on those fronts.
Any journalism questions? Fashion round?
This is actually for both of you. Where do you see the fashion industry going in the next 5 years? With, obviously, Cassidy mentioned the metaverse, and with now there's more sustainability practices as we would like to think, but of course there's also greenwashing. So where do you see maybe this gap between digital improvement, and also there's a lot of brands that are still lagging behind with human rights issues as well. So where do you see kind of the gap being closed, or more brands getting, I guess, like hip to what's going on in the future?
Ellie, would you like to?
I would say like a lot of brands during COVID really kind of sat back and took a look at themselves and worked, like I'm thinking of Pier Paolo, the creative director of Valentino, really talking about how there needs to be a change in fashion. You're seeing more diversity in the staffing of these larger luxury brands. So I think, they have recognized that there needs to be a need. So I think maybe in the next 5 years, we're going to see more diversity in the hiring roles. LVMH, Kering, they really have tried with the Italian factories and the corruption and mistreating and labor rights violations of workers to really not work with factories who have these kinds of problems. Like they've made commitments and pledges, and Kering has made a huge pledge, like by it's skipped my mind, but like 2020 something to, have things in place where things are diverse within fashion. So I think we'll start seeing some movement there. Maybe as you talk, some things will come to mind.
Sure. So, I mean, just kind of picking up from what you're saying, there will definitely, I think the current generation is very no-nonsense generation.
Mm-hmm.
They want to know things down to the point what it is. You can't say, this is it, and, make them turn one side and not look at another side.
Mm-hmm.
I think transparency is really crucial for the current generation. If you want them to buy your product, they would want to know things. So I think brands will need to be authentic in what they're doing and saying. But equally, I think there are a lot of science-based developments that are happening which will enable brands to measure and broadcast what they're doing. It's not like saying this is organic and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
There are systems out there which will enable brands to say this percentage of our textiles are organic, this percentage is not, so we need to do something about that.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot is being done in the science space for that. So I think there's no space to hide.
Mm-hmm. And calling out cultural appropriation within fashion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think COVID really woke up the industry on the areas in which it needs to be better. And there are people in fashion who have a heart. The stereotype of fashion being snobby, and that is true to some extent, but there are really people who really do care about these issues, and they've hired like inclusivity and diverse officers within brands.
Yeah, I mean, even within the British Fashion Council, I'm aware that they are working on these agendas that they would share with the wider British fashion industry to encourage the bigger companies who have bigger staff to be inclusive in the way, and not just limit their inclusivity to ad campaigns and to make it feel like we're inclusive, and in the company, all the senior people are, either one particular type of race and so forth. But I think you mentioned something about the digital and the traditional way of doing fashion. I think if you were looking at transition of that space between now and the next 5 years, I feel like I think we will all still be wearing clothes, there's no doubt about that. But I think we probably will go for a little bit more. I think the look would be a little bit more robotic.
Mm-hmm.
We'd probably prefer to have blue hair. And no, I think the product as we know it today will continue to exist. But I think the ownership might change quite drastically. We might be leasing dresses as opposed to buying dresses.
Like rent the runway.
Like renting. But I think that it will become more easy and more embedded in the way we buy and consume product. And I think some companies might take back their product and give you a new product, or I think the way we consume is less about. That's how I feel. I'm not sure that's actually going to happen or how quickly that's going to happen. But 5 years is quite a long time. So.
And like NFTs, I was interviewing Paul Smith. I don't know if you know the British designer, and I was asking him would he ever move in the direction of NFTs, and a lot of designers are, and he said no, absolutely not. But he's of a different generation. Maybe he will change his tune in 5 years because a lot of designers are moving in that direction.
I have a question, like how do existing brands step up into a space like, let's say London is so diverse in terms of nationalities, so how do you influence them towards a particular type of fashion influence?
I'm not sure I fully understand your question.
So like, let's say someone from Africa or someone from India, like they want to set up a store and they want to influence certain type of fashion influence, like in London. So like there are too many nationalities, so how do you do that?
I think it's probably the answer would apply to any business, not just fashion business, is to reach out to the right departments, because I think UK is quite open to having international investments and international organizations setting up offices and opening stores. There's that openness, and the government encourages actually investment from outside, creating jobs and things like that. So I think reaching out to the Department of International Trade and seeing how an existing company might have stores here, or if it's about.
I mean, in terms of like targeting the customers.
Like a specific demographic?
Yeah.
Oh,
No,
I guess.
not like a specific demographic, but in terms of like influencing to all the demographics as much as possible.
So an international company that wants to target the UK market by opening stores here, is that what you mean to ask?
Yeah.
I guess you would go to a consulting company to get those numbers of trying to open that brand and influence that market. That's, I think, where they would start,
Yeah, because I think having
McKinsey or something.
Yeah.
To get the
I think
statistics.
Ali would know this better because let's say she's attended all these shows at Paris Fashion Week, and these brands at Paris Fashion Week have stores here in London. So essentially, like you said, there are business intelligence platforms like McKinsey.
Even in-house, there would be a lot of research done in-house because Valentino is going to be in every market. So they're going to already have internal teams that really look at selling to the Chinese versus the British. And then I guess if they need larger numbers, they will go to a larger or a consulting firm to get those on how to input. And then they would probably tap into influencers in that market too. Whether, like, if Valentino's launching a leopard bag in Dubai, they may not launch that in New York to the US market. It's when I get press releases from brands, and sometimes I'll say to the Middle East market, oh, are you launching this product? Or like, for example, Celine, they have a candle coming out. It's been launched in the Middle East a long time, but they're not going to launch it in the US until October. So I'm sure there's reasons and times and research of why they're going to launch something in one market, when or where or not.
Okay, and about investors, like what kind of perspectives should they look from, like getting a franchise anywhere?
You might know the answer to that.
So I think if you're going to go down the franchise route, I think I'm not a specialist about franchising, but there is an element where you have an open window where you welcome expression of interest. So there are organizations that are purely, opening franchises, and that's their business. So when you welcome expression of interest, then you see if people who work in franchise in the UK or in London specifically, they're interested in having a franchise of your brand. So it's kind of like, almost like sending out an information deck to people who do franchise and to see if they would be interested in taking up your franchise. But I think it depends on how broad you want it to be. Do you want 70 stores across UK, or do you want one good store in a good location? I think if it's one good store in a good location, I would say tap into your existing network, professional or personal, to see who you know. and have those direct conversations. But if you want to go for a 70, then it might be worthwhile hiring someone who's a franchise expert in the market so they can connect you with the right people and get interest to come through. So both of which is possible. I think, it would be a matter of deciding how big or how small you want to start.
I feel like I'm asking. Do you want to ask first, actually?
Yeah, I was wondering how big is your team, because you said you want to focus on craftsmanship,
So the immediate team is quite small actually. It's me and 3 other people, let's say, working full time. But at the broader team, people who work in the factory, people who work in the embroidery unit, that is broader. I mean, our factory that we work with in Italy has 25 seamstresses. The embroidering company that we work with, which is based in India, I think they are about 25, 30 people who have been doing embroidery for 4 or 5 generations. So, that's not my immediate team, but the team itself, that's basically.
But that's normal for like a brand of your size. They have a team of 3, 4, 5. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I guess my question was also, you guys are both based in London.
No. Yeah, so I lived in Beirut for 3 years, and how I got into fashion, covering Lebanese couture designers, so I'm in transition. I thought I would live in Paris, but the Parisian people are Parisian. So I'm thinking, I lived in Spain in university, so I think I'll go back there. I can be based anywhere, being the journalist. Sometimes, I've gone to Dubai to cover Arab Fashion Week. I can live anywhere, unlike you have to be in London.
Well, because I was gonna ask, what, from an outsider's perspective as well, what do you think are London's specific strengths and weaknesses in regards to the fashion world?
I think there are more strengths than weaknesses. The strengths are, I think, the government, as I mentioned before, is quite supportive of businesses starting out here. You have access to a lot of business intelligence, consultancy firm you mentioned. If you go to the British Library, they have all these research that you can access for free. You don't need to invest in that research. It's being done. There are reports. You can just download them and take a look. But that's just one example. There's a lot of information and support and workshops that are there that can get you started with setting up a business here. And it's a lot simpler to register a company and run a company from London than it would be, I think those paperwork can be quite detailed in some other countries. The fashion community here is really diverse, and I think, the British Fashion Council, again, is quite a nurturing umbrella for its designers. It feels like you're part of a bigger family, through the crises. It never felt like we were just one company trying to make it. There were newsletters coming through, there were webinars, you could, get information about what's going on. They took initiative to put together funds to support businesses that were in real crises. So I think those are elements that, I would say is nice and nurturing from the industry. But equally, in a way, it's a very competitive space. You have a new brand being started every I'm sure there are hundreds of designers graduating every year and starting companies, and to get noticed or, to really get the appraisal that you need is tough. But it's that challenge that makes you want to do better and do more, and but also it's a very expensive city, like we spoke about earlier. London is probably one of the more expensive cities in the world, so that is probably a challenge at the beginning. If it's an expensive city, it attracts rich people, so you can have access to affluent clientele. So yeah,
I think maybe a slight weakness. The 4 major fashion weeks in a year are New York, London, Milan, and Paris. Paris is number 1. And if you're showing in Paris, that means you've got some sort of prestige, and for the Federation to accept you for Paris Fashion Week, it's very hard to get in. And you're going to be attracting a level of clientele and buyers and journalists that maybe don't go to London.
it's true.
It's true. A good friend of mine, I said, "Oh hey, let's go do London Fashion Week." He's like, "Ew, London Fashion Week? Like, isn't it about to shut down?" Like, I never hear.
Oh no.
I know, but I say that Because I think that's the perception that people who really don't know fashion so well may have of London. I think London can do some work to come up to where it used to be. London was really top with Alexander McQueen shows and
Yeah.
the same prestige that Paris had. But at the reasons that you gave, the positivity, London really, I don't know if the French are really helping start businesses and how easy it is. I think London's very supportive of the government.
Yeah, I think I agree. This season I noticed so many of the brands that are British brands have actually shown during Paris Fashion Week as opposed to London, which says something. I'm sure every fashion week has its positives. The government doing what they're doing is to keep, I would say, talents and investments within the country as much as possible. But I mean, like you said, London needs to do some work to come back up.
Yeah, but it's still nice.
Especially with like Brexit and everything hitting the luxury sector.
Yeah, we've not been such well behaved.
Mhm.
we've done somewhat naughty things, not so good with Brexit for sure.
Yeah. Maybe one last question. I think you had one.
I did. Not talking like about the market in general, but just about your brand specifically. Like, what have you decided are your priorities in the short term, as far as like what you're focusing on in spaces that maybe you feel if you don't invest in now, that you'll feel behind in a year or so from now when the market kind of moves in this direction?
I think we've been in business since 7 years now, so I think the priority, at least up until now, has been definitely the product and how to create value that stays in the customer experience of the brand. I think going forward, priority is always going to the product itself, because that is what the brand stands for in a way. But I think we're wanting to expand the product offering, because I think a lot of the brands that are, we wanted to cater to a wider group of people, have a portfolio of product, whereas for us the focus has been so far ready-to-wear and evening wear. We wanted to kind of expand that, and we've introduced a small selection of jewelry as of 2020. Does that answer your question? The priority is the product.
Kinda, yeah. So like, because I was thinking like a growth and development perspective, like what would help you remain competitive, and so you're saying you think that expansion in your product offerings in your line will give you your competitive edge?
I think the competitive edge would always be, I think, primarily the product, because that is what you're selling, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that needs to be layered with the right sales channels, the right people looking at your product as well. So it needs to be seen at the right places. So I think if I was to add another layer to product, it would be the distribution channel that the brand has, which has been quite niche, I have to be honest, up until now. We have loyal clientele and we have a reasonably high profile clientele, but I think we've not scratched the surface as to who else could be seeing the product, who else could be. I think there was a vast scope for expansion there.
Yeah, please.
Can I ask? You said you kind of started like near to nothing funding. And if you could explain the timeline on how long it took you and what were the biggest challenge you faced and how you got here, basically.
Okay, my honest answer is, I trained in designing fashion. I can make the product myself. So at the beginning when I started, I didn't hire people to make the collection. I was making the collection. The first 2 seasons, I maybe found ways to source fabric that wasn't costing us much, making the product in-house, and really limiting costs. Our outgoings were able to be kept at next to nothing, and we were investing in the showcasing costs to do the exhibitions, to do that. And then I think, because the segment that we are placed in, it enabled us not to have to do volume business to start seeing returns. So I could sell 5 dresses and still make it work at the beginning, because of the margin and the exclusivity and so forth. So I think that enabled, then the idea was to invest little but put back whatever revenue we were generating into the business. And I did, I would say I tried to go put myself out there and get some independent boutiques, which are a lot easier to get into, where we would sell the product. And that built a little bit visibility, and some other independent boutique was kind of be interested in stocking us. And So it was slow growth, but you would still see movement happening, you know. I mean, with the first dress I sold, I still remember. I remember the look it was, and we sold it through a boutique in Kings Road, and I was like, oh my God, people are paying for my product. But you know, I think it starts from there. You know, when you see that people are actually, you know, that you see that season by season you're able to create a new season and then put the collection into some channels where people are buying it. I think it was kind of like that. But the initial, I would say, if I was to say about one challenge, it was to kind of make it to get noticed. Because when we first applied to even exhibit at an off-schedule exhibition, there's so much competition. People will say, I'm sorry, we can't accommodate you, or we're not looking to add new designers, or you know, something around those lines. So that persistence. You had a really, you know, hard time putting together the collection. Now you want to place it in the right exhibition or at the right, you know, fashion week and whatever, and you get 10 rejection. It's kind of like, oh my God, how am I going to go through this, you know? So I think that faith and belief in what you do is really key.
First of all, thank you for being with us today. I don't have much information about fashion, but I just wanted to understand what is the shared goal of all the companies? Why do they, what do they strive for at the end goal? What is it? As in, do they try to change the fashion trends of the world? And I would like to ask, what is your market? Who is your market usually? Who are you selling to? Thank you.
Yeah, so 2 questions that is. The
Yeah.
first one, I think the industry's common goal, I think, is to keep people inspired through the way they express themselves through clothes. I think we all like to see variety, and we all like to, I think, you know, what we put on in the morning really influences how we feel during the day. So I think the common goal, in my perspective, would be to keep people interested in the way they put themselves out. And it doesn't always have to be buying from a brand. It could be from a thrift shop. It could be from, you know, you put together things and come up with a look that you define as yourself. So that is the goal. That's why we put up the shows. We have these themes, and you know, we have the sound and everything else that goes with the show. That probably is a common goal. Like similar to art, you know how art is kind of for the sake of the art, to inspire thinking, and it's a way of entertainment, but fashion is art with a function, so to say. I think, and the second part of the question was, who's my market?
Who's your market usually? Because you do very unique pieces, right? Who's your market? Who do you want your piece to buy, for instance?
So I'll start by, you know, looking at people who have been buying or who have bought into the brand. It's usually women who are looking for something that's not widely available, something that you can wear and people would guess which brand that is from. Kind of like, in a way, to stand out from the crowd. But a lot of people who also buy from other people who are, you know, interested in what we're doing in terms of the story of the brand, the reason why we started. And funnily enough, I thought when I started out, my market would be a slightly younger woman who likes to dress, look and feel beautiful, but it has to be a slightly more mature woman who is wanting to not be that person who wears the same dress to the work party, or, you know, goes to an event and gets asked where did you get that from, that's cool. So I think it's slightly more mature women, but I think, like I mentioned previously on Transit, we've not scratched the surface of who could be our market. I think the desirability of the product could be multiplied by maybe 100 times, because we've not really done that much, you know, widespread selling, or our channels are quite limited at this point. But technically, I think when I define my customer, it's any woman or anyone who identifies as woman who wants to look and feel beautiful in what she's wearing. It doesn't have to be by the age group or, you know, body type. It can be anyone.
Well, thank you all for coming. Hope that you